Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade. This is the Education Show, and I'm delighted to have Dan Kennedy here to talk about all things journalism. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
You are famous to me, but perhaps not famous to everyone out there. Would you spend 2 seconds telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm a journalism professor at Northeastern University and a media commentator. These days, I do most of my commenting on my blog, Media Nation, which is at dankennedy.net. I specialize in the future of local news. I'm the co author with Ellen Clegg of a book called What Works in Community News. And before coming into academia 20 years ago, I was the longtime media columnist at the Boston Phoenix. And I've done a bunch of other stuff too, but haven't we all?
It's great to have you here. It's January 2026. What's your take overall on the state of journalism as we start this new year?
Well, the day that we're talking is the day after the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette announced that they would be shutting down this May. So I am an eternal optimist about the future of journalism, but it sometimes gets hard to remain optimistic when all of these bad news stories come at us. That said, I think it's a very perilous moment for journalism, but I also think that journalism is too vital to society to worry about it going away entirely.
In New England, the area you specialize in, is there anything perilous happening or about to happen along the lines of the Pittsburgh situation?
Here in New England, I think the news is actually pretty good. Um, Let me just focus on Massachusetts for a moment. The Boston Globe is one of a tiny handful of large regional newspapers that is independently owned and doing reasonably well. They continue to hire from time to time, and they really take their obligation to do public service journalism very seriously. We also have, there are many projects, and I hate to leave any out, but I think one of the things that's top of mind for me right now is Mass Live, which is the digital arm of the Republican newspaper in Springfield. It's part of the Advance chain. They've been growing. They announced some pretty ambitious moves just this week. And since this is a show about education, I should say that they are going to be doing a pilot project of covering public education K to 12 in Worcester County. So that's just Massachusetts, but there's good things going on in Maine, Vermont especially, but also Rhode Island. And uh, some people tell me that Connecticut's part of New England. I guess right up to the border of where it's still Red Sox country should be considered New England.
I'm also interested in tracking what I'm going to call the non traditional news ecosystem. And I have the sense that things are relatively good in that area as well. I've talked to Scott Van Voorhis. Are there non traditional or formerly traditional, but on an emerging platform, news sources that you and other New England types get to benefit from, or are we still in a mostly traditional dominated system?
Actually, we've had quite a bit of activity at the grassroots level in recent years. Uh, a few years ago, Gannett um, either shut down or merged virtually all of their weekly newspapers in the greater Boston area. And, uh, and even the ones they kept going, they removed all the local news from them. So you had already had a trickle of startup digital news sites, most of them nonprofit, but not all of them. Some of them were for profit. But over the last 2 or 3 years, there's really been a huge upsurge
Mhm.
in the number of community based digital news operations, independent, locally owned, or in the case of nonprofits, I should say locally controlled. And that's been a very heartening development. You also have some really important digital startups in each of the New England states. I
Mhm.
was making fun of Connecticut a moment ago, but one project I've been tracking for, oh gosh, 15 years at this point, is the New Haven Independent, which is one of the original nonprofit digital startups. They're still going strong, founded in 2005, and it's both a digital website. Well, what other kind of website would there be, right? It's both a website and a community radio station,
Right.
and they're doing very impressive work.
Yeah, the radio station is a fascinating element to me. If if we're not in danger of having a news desert in the areas that you're most familiar with, how about the quality? Because as I've seen in other places, New York City, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Los Angeles, sometimes it's not that there's a issue with quantity, but there's an issue with quality. What's your take on the quality of the coverage that you see, traditional or otherwise?
Well, since you invoke the news desert phrase, one of the downsides to what I've seen is that the growth of these community news projects has been impressive, but it's spotty. You could have a really good project in one town, and in the next town over, there's nothing. And for your listeners who may not understand how things are laid out in Massachusetts, county government is a non factor here. We
Right.
have 351 cities and towns, and every one of them needs strong local coverage because things are done at the town or city level. You also have situations where affluent, well educated communities in the suburbs are much better able to take care of their news needs than are um, places that are much farther away from the urban core or urban communities of color. So, for instance, I mentioned you can find a number of communities in Massachusetts that have nothing. Meanwhile, you take a town like Marblehead, which is affluent, suburban, well educated. They have three independent news projects in that town. You'd really like to see the wealth spread around a little bit more. Now, you ask about varying quality.
Yeah.
I've been in this business for a very long time. I was a community news reporter myself in the 1980s, and the quality's always been hit or miss. You've always had some communities that are very well covered, and some other communities that may have a legacy newspaper that everybody reads, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing a very good job. And I think we see the same today.
What do you make of the claim I see online and hear sometimes when I talk to Boston area journalists that the Globe, the outlet that we should expect the most from, is overly deferential to political powers, that it's not as aggressive or skeptical as it should be in this era of concern about the Trump administration?
Yeah, well, good grief. I thought you threw me a curve there at the last second because I thought you were going to be asking me if I thought the Globe was too easy on people like Governor Maura Healey and Boston Mayor Michelle Wu. Um,
That's
I
my
think,
that's the question I intended to ask.
okay, well, then you went off to Trump at the last minute because I think that they've been extremely tough in their Trump coverage. More so than some of the national outlets, not all of them, but some of them. Uh, you know, it's hard for me to gauge. I know that there are some people who think that the Globe is much too deferential toward the mayor and the governor. Maybe they could be doing a tougher job of holding them to account. It doesn't strike me that it's very different from what I've seen for many years now. I think that the Globe and some other news outlets um, were fairly easy in their coverage of Governor Charlie Baker, Governor Deval Patrick, Mayor Marty Walsh, Mayor Tom Menino. So this is kind of a long-standing situation, and I think that we also have to be prepared to consider the possibility that maybe these elected officials have been doing a pretty good job. And so the idea of raking them over the coals every day wouldn't make an awful lot of sense. But that's not to say that there aren't certain areas that they're falling short in that maybe they ought to be held to account a little bit more than they are.
About 10 years ago, one of the spotlight editors from the Globe came and addressed a group of education journalists and urged us not to do what the Globe had done with the Catholic Church, which is to defer to their reputation and their celebrity, for lack of a better word, and to treat schools like the Globe had eventually come to treat the church, an important institution that needs scrutiny as much as any other. And then a few years after that, the Globe produced a story called The Valedictorians Project, a series of stories about what happens to Boston's best and brightest high school graduates. And from that came something that's now called The Great Divide. Do you remember back at the time when the Valedictorians Project was launched? And do you remember if you had any thoughts, pro or con, excited or worried about the idea of a foundation-funded entity within the Globe?
Uh, well, I think that there's several questions there, and let me try to pick them apart a bit. Um, I am not somebody who is particularly concerned about foundation-funded journalism because of so much of my work is in reporting and researching on nonprofits that are very dependent on foundation funding. Um, the challenge with foundation funding is that you have to strike a balance between taking their money to fund coverage in a certain topic area without allowing them to influence how you cover it. And I think that some there may be occasions where some of these foundations need to be educated. I think that Barr is pretty sophisticated about their expectations when they fund journalism. And of course, they funded a GBH News and I think also maybe at WBUR, I'm not sure, Commonwealth Beacon. So yes, they're funding education coverage at the Globe, but they're doing that at a lot of different places. I thought the Valedictorian Project was terrific. I do remember it. And it was kind of a signal moment in taking a look at the way education is covered in Boston. And if I may, I mean, that kind of points out to just kind of a general observation I would make about newspaper journalism, not just at the Globe, but at many places.
Right.
And that is, you often will find that when they really dig down and do some serious enterprise reporting, they do a great job. And then in the day-to-day coverage, that's where I think some of the softness tends to come in. I'm sure that you know that the national media are constantly being criticized for um, their supposedly soft treatment and normalization of Donald Trump. And on a day-to-day basis, I think there's something to that criticism. But when they really dig in and do investigative reporting on the Trump administration, generally speaking, it's very tough and very valuable. And not just at the New York Times, but even at the Washington Post, even now, despite owner Jeff Bezos's move to pretty much destroy the opinion section, apparently so as not to offend Trump. That has not bled over into their news coverage.
What's your take on the claim that public radio stations and television stations, Boston has two of them operating, sometimes tend also to aim coverage towards pleasing affluent readers rather than looking deep at the dark side of things? Do you have any takes on GBH and BUR on education or on other topics?
Yeah, well, I worked for GBH News for many years. I was part of their Beat the Press TV show for 22 years and was a columnist for them for quite a while as well. So I really don't have an unbiased view of what they do at GBH News. I do think that the biggest challenge facing public media in lining up funding is that, in fact, they tend to get their money from foundations and people who are part of their audience, which is white, middle class, upper middle class, affluent. And I think it's a constant battle to make sure that you're serving other communities as well. From what I've seen, WBUR and GBH have made a concerted effort to reach out to those communities, even if they're not part of the core audience. But of course, now the temptation to do that type of pandering to your audience is stronger than ever because the government funding has been taken away, and now all of public media's funding has to come from uh, foundations, rich individuals, and as they say, readers and viewers. I'm sorry, listeners and viewers like you.
There's a podcast produced by non-journalists. They're actually foundation people, called Last Night's Committee Meeting. It's a half-hour show about what happened at the Boston Schools Committee meeting so that people who don't have the time to listen or watch or attend can get a recap. The podcast has been profiled a couple of times by the Globe, but it hasn't been copied and stolen the way that I think it should be. Why wouldn't someone in the education journalism field in Boston run a recap like that when someone else is doing it?
Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't they partner with them? It seems to me that it would make total sense to partner with a project like that. I don't know. I see that the former editor of the Globe, Brian McGrory, has just returned as the editor of the Globe. And, he certainly was a very successful editor during his first stint. And maybe that's something that he ought to look at now that he's beginning his second stint.
One of my favorite outlets in terms of promising and unconventional was The Emancipator, which last year, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Boston busing controversy, ran a quite amazing and quite distinct series about busing that made its readers rethink what they thought they understood. What happened to The Emancipator? What does it tell us about the ecosystem of Boston news outlets? And is there something else like it coming that we could look to and support and cheer on?
Well, I'm not sure of anything that is coming along. The Emancipator, I believe, is still around, isn't it? It's now fully part of Boston University, whereas it had been split between Boston University and the Globe before
It
that.
it moved a second time from Boston University down to DC. I don't think it operates in the Boston area anymore. And I'm not sure of the backroom dealings or negotiations that led to that shift. Is there anything else Emancipator like that you? I keep waiting for Yahoo Miller's The Flip Side to take off. Is there anything else out there that close watchers could or should know about?
I think that now that you mention it, I think now that you mention it, I think the Emancipator may have followed Ibram X. Kendi when he left Boston. He was the co-founder along with Bina Venkatraman, who at the time was the editorial page editor at the Globe. You know what I think people really ought to keep an eye on is, in Boston at least, is the Bay State Banner, which has been covering communities of color in Greater Boston going back to 1966. But they had an ownership change within the last couple of years, and the people who are running it now are looking to find ways to bring in more money and expand their mission. Um, I think that's something people ought to keep a close eye on. It's always been good quality, but I think it's getting better. And it's something that I know that some of our Northeastern students have interacted with at various times. And I would keep an eye on that.
That's great to know. One of the most exciting things that's happening nationally that I'm aware of is the emergence of a handful of outlets on the left that are reporting on and examining what I'm going to call liberal orthodoxies. The one I know best is The Argument with Jerusalem Demsis and Kelsey Piper. Are there folks coming from the left, the way that the Phoenix might have years ago, and asking hard questions in traditional or unorthodox ways, like The Argument is nationally?
I don't see an awful lot of the traditional alt weekly mission of trying to hold their local media to account. It seems to me that everybody wants to comment on what's going on in the media nationally. And I think that this is one of the downsides of everything moving online. Um, I was at the Boston Phoenix for a very long time, and I have to say, in the early years, almost everything I did was local because that's where our audience was. And that would have been in the early and mid 1990s. And toward my last few years at the Phoenix, 10 or 12 years after that, we were starting to get a small national audience because of, the early days of the internet. And I have to tell you, it just became very tempting to uh, serve that audience. You might get mentioned in one of the national websites or something, which was always very exciting. But what I really think we need is to hold to account political and media power in our own backyard. And I just don't see an awful lot of that happening.
I was going to ask, are there one or several Dan Kennedys who are encouraging reflection and accountability on the part of newsrooms? Are the newsrooms themselves participating in self-reflection the way we might want them to be?
You know, it's there was a time when many very good newspapers had public editors, ombudsmen. Um, the Globe had one, the New York Times had the public editor, the Washington Post had the ombudsman. And this was kind of throughout the land. And these were in house critics who were able to talk with the power structure within their news organizations and use that access to hold them to account. And it was a very valuable function. And I think that as a result of the financial crisis that the news business found itself in, um, it became a reason to get rid of that position where editors would say, well, what do you want, an ombudsman, or you want another city hall reporter? And I think the natural reaction would be, well, we really ought to cover city hall. But then, even as certain news outlets have done very well, including the New York Times and the Boston Globe, they have not brought back that ombudsman position. And I think it's something that they really ought to consider.
One of the things that I had forgotten until I used the Google search magic button was that you and I spoke maybe 10 years ago in the aftermath of the passage of question 2, which was about raising the charter schools cap in Massachusetts. The details of this are not of the proposed resolution are not so important, but you said something which I can't claim to remember, but I saw recently in an early column from the grade. You made an observation that has stuck with me in the sense that it's an ongoing problem for education journalism and maybe other beats as well, which was that a policy issue becomes covered as politics. Question 2 would have raised the number of charter schools allowed in the state. There was ferocious debate and a reasonable amount of media coverage. And when I called you and said, what was your take on the coverage? You said, well, it ended up getting covered as a political story. And all these years later, I'm wondering, have you or has anyone else figured out a way to cover deeply important topics without turning them into political food fight coverage?
You know, I think that that is still one of the single biggest problems with journalism. And I would go back to something that I said a few minutes ago, which is that when you get into the deep enterprise coverage that news organizations will occasionally do, that's where you get beyond covering things like they're a political food fight, and you really get into the substance and depth that I think that we need in a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
But day-to-day coverage tends to be like covering these things like a sporting event. Who's raised more money? How's the issue polling?
Mm-hmm.
Who's on whose side? And rarely do you get into the real substance of issues like this. And you can only hope that at some point that big enterprise story will come along to undergird the daily coverage that they're doing.
One of the things that seems to happen from my perspective, tell me if I'm correct in this or have got it all wrong, is that the news, the daily news, tends to seem to sort of emulate social media. High outrage, high conflict, horse race coverage, some call it. And frankly, there's no distinct value to paid journalists doing what everyone else does for free on Twitter all day. And yet, when I talk to journalists about rethinking their coverage, or when I talk to people who are involved in helping journalists do that, there's an interesting effort at the Pointer Institute to help folks transform crime coverage. They say that the problem is that their readers expect the red meat every day, and that the readers don't want the story that might complicate the narrative a little bit. So, is there a way? Have you seen? And maybe I'm asking you if there's a Santa Claus or if unicorns really exist. But is there a way for news desks to cover issues in ways that are more helpful?
Well, you brought up crime coverage, and why don't we go with that for a minute? Because I do think that in recent years, many of us in journalism have realized that we were doing it wrong all along. As I told you, I go back to the 80s, even the 70s a little bit. And you would just go to the police station, um, copy the juiciest stuff from the log, rewrite it, and go with it. And this was just absolutely the wrong way of doing it. And I'm trying to think of how I can telescope this, because I could go on for 15 minutes about something that they did at the Keene Sentinel in New Hampshire. But I will just say that essentially they made a decision, and you mentioned Pointer. They worked with Pointer on this, that they were going to completely change the way they covered crime. They were no longer going to cover minor police news. They were no longer going to name people who had been charged with fairly minor offenses. And they weren't going to report any crime at all unless they decided that this was important enough to make a commitment to follow through the entire court system. And they said, if we can't do that, then we have no business covering the original incident. What they wanted to do instead was focus on trends, um, certain aspects of racial inequity in law enforcement, and I think they managed to do that. Um, but I still see way too many news outlets simply reporting minor police news that is of very little interest to anybody. And you mentioned social media. It was also on, local TV news the night before. And the audience for newspapers these days is fairly old. I have nothing against old people, being one myself. And the audience for local TV news is fairly old. So it's the same audience consuming this non nutritious journalism.
Do you see any indications that traditional journalism is going to rescue itself from the uh, AARPA ivory tower that they've constructed?
That is such an enormously important issue. Um, I know that of a couple of my colleagues here at Northeastern, Mike Bodette and Lisa Talhammer, were just on the podcast that Ellen Clegg and I do, talking about their project to reinvent local TV news. And they're talking about trying to reach a younger audience through greater use of social media and other techniques. I think that the newspaper business, whether you're talking about actual print or digital, um, it's a challenge because I think that the people who are interested in local and regional news tend to be on the older side.
Mhm.
And whenever editors get it in their heads that they're going to try to appeal to a younger audience, I think that they come off a little bit like uh, maybe Chuck Schumer would be the example I would use. I mean, it just seems like they're a little bit clueless and pandering,
Mhm.
even though they're trying their best to try to figure out how to tap into that audience.
Whenever I think about journalistic reinvention, which I'm excited about and think is necessary, it makes me think of the Democratic Party. How do they reinvent themselves without losing their base, offending their base so much? Uh, newspaper Newspapers have to come up with a reinvention that may risk in the short term or in the long term losing some of those dedicated readers and subscribers that they've had for a long time.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's a good idea because there's still a lot of older people who are relatively satisfied with the news product as it is. And why would you drive them away? I mean, I think that maybe what you want to do is to try to develop some ancillary news products
Mhm.
that are specifically designed for a younger audience,
Right,
again, without pandering. I
right.
mean, I teach journalism students, so they're a little bit more savvy about the news than maybe some of their generational peers are. But if you try pandering to them, they'll pick up on it in a second, and they're completely turned off by that.
One of the things that makes me hopeful is that 20 or so years ago, bloggers and blogging came along, and journalism initially turned up its noses at bloggers for the informality, etc., but then ended up adopting both some of the approaches and also ended up hiring some of the best of the blogging generation out there. The situation's a little bit different because of Trump and the disinclination to reinvent, but it would be an amazing thing if traditional news outlets adopted some of the strategies and some of the personnel that are most talented and able to share accurate information.
Well, that's right. But now we're seeing a bit of a move in the opposite direction where people are leaving established news organizations and setting up their own newsletters. And what we used to call blogs. I mean, blogs are newsletters, newsletters are blogs. But we also see some people in the mainstream media who have adopted some of the newer techniques in a way that can be pretty effective. Just this morning, I was showing my students a video that New York Times columnist Jamel Bowie did, commenting on the police shooting of um, Rachel Good in Minneapolis. And he just did an absolutely terrific job. He's just standing around his backyard, um, giving this really impassioned but very cogent commentary for 2 or 3 minutes. And my students were quite taken with it. And they're used to seeing influencers who they don't know whether they can trust or not
Mhm.
doing material like that. They were not used to seeing a New York Times columnist doing that.
Right. That's a great point. Until recently, there was a Boston Globe reporter who went on TikTok, an educational reporter, which is why I happen to know her. Her name's Mandy McLaren. She went on TikTok thinking that she was going to find kids to talk to, She didn't find them, she told me, but she found a lot of young parents and young teachers, and made TikTok segments part of her work in a way that I thought was similar and quite impressive. We need more of that bridge kind of behavior.
We do, and editors need to understand that that takes time too. So you can't say, well, do all the work you've always been doing and then make 3 TikTok videos each week. That doesn't work. That just doesn't work.
Let's finish up. We're on a podcast right now. You mentioned a podcast. Tell us a little bit about your podcast and what you're up to next in January and February.
Okay. Ellen Clegg and I, who I mentioned the book that we wrote earlier, we also do a podcast that preceded the book called What Works? The Future of Local News. And it's based here at Northeastern at the School of Journalism and the Center for Transformative Media. And twice a month, we interview local news publishers, entrepreneurs, thought leaders. I hate the term thought leaders, but they are thought leaders. And we think that we have developed a very small but very dedicated listenership for that. We are going to continue with that, obviously. We are planning what will probably end up being a all-day webinar of workshops for practical skills for local news publishers that will be held later this spring. We had talked about an in-person conference. There were several problems with that, but we also said, if we go with a webinar, we can tap into a national audience instead of just people who are within an hour of Boston. And then, other than that, I'm writing my blog and teaching my students.
Excellent. Dan Kennedy, you've been so helpful. Dan Kennedy, Media Nation, thank you so much for participating.
Thanks a lot for having me.